In the remote hills of eastern Oregon, buried beneath decades of official silence, lies a truth so horrifying that local authorities suppressed it for over a century. Between 1852 and 1888, more than 800 pioneers vanished along a 20-mile stretch of the Oregon Trail, not to disease, not to accidents, but to something far more sinister. The Sacred Heart Chapel, a modest wooden structure that promised salvation to dying travelers, was actually the epicenter of the most methodical mass murder scheme in American frontier history. What began as isolated disappearances became a family enterprise so calculated, so ruthlessly efficient, that it redefined evil itself. The Grayson family didn't just kill for money, they perfected it into an art form, keeping meticulous records of every life they took, every family they destroyed, every dream they buried in shallow graves. Before we descend into the darkness that consumed the Grayson family and their victims, I need to ask something of you. This channel isn't for everyone, only for those brave enough to confront the most disturbing truths hidden in America's past. If you're one of the few who can handle these dark revelations, subscribe now and leave a comment telling me what state you're listening from. Your support helps us uncover the stories that others dare not tell. Now, let's journey back to 1852, when the Oregon Trail promised hope but delivered horror. The Oregon Trail stretched like a lifeline across the American frontier, carrying dreams westward through 2,000 meters of unforgiving wilderness. For the thousands of families who sold everything they owned for a chance at a new life, each mile represented both hope and peril. Disease, starvation, and natural disasters claimed countless lives. But in the rolling hills of eastern Oregon, death wore a different face, one that smiled with Christian compassion while calculating the value of a family's possessions. The year 1852 marked the peak of Oregon Trail migration, with over 50,000 people making the treacherous journey west. By the time most wagon trains reached the Blue Mountains of Oregon, they had already traveled nearly 1,800 meters. Families were exhausted, supplies were running low, and the weakest members were often succumbing to trail fever, dysentery, and other ailments that turned dreams of prosperity into desperate struggles for survival. It was in this landscape of vulnerability that Father Morai Grayson established the Sacred Heart Chapel in 1851. The weathered wooden structure sat perched on a hill overlooking a natural stopping point along the trail, a place where weary travelers often paused to rest their oxen and bury their dead. To passing pioneers, the chapel represented divine providence, a beacon of hope in the wilderness where they could seek spiritual comfort and, if needed, proper Christian burial for their loved ones. Father Morai, a tall, gaunt man in his 42nd with penetrating grey eyes and a voice that commanded respect, had arrived in Oregon territory, claiming to be a traveling missionary. He spoke eloquently about his calling to serve the spiritual needs of westward-bound families, and his knowledge of Scripture seemed genuine enough to convince even the most skeptical travelers. Beside him stood his devoted wife, who took the name Sister Constance, a woman whose gentle manner and apparent medical knowledge made her invaluable to families struggling with sick children and dying relatives. Brother Ezekiel, Morai's younger sibling, completed the trio that would become synonymous with both salvation and damnation. Where Morai possessed the commanding presence of a natural leader, Ezekiel was the practical one, skilled with his hands, knowledgeable about livestock, and always ready to help struggling families repair their wagons or tend to their animals. Together, the three created an image of Christian charity that drew desperate families like moths to a flame. The chapel itself was modest but well-maintained, built from local timber, with a small cemetery adjacent to the main building. Inside, rough-hewn pews faced a simple altar, adorned with a wooden cross that Morai claimed to have carved himself. The building's most distinctive feature was its unusually large basement, which the Grayson explained as necessary storage for supplies they kept on hand to help destitute travelers. The surrounding community was sparse, a few scattered homesteads, and a small trading post about 15 miles to the east. This isolation served the Graysons well, as it meant fewer witnesses to their activities and less chance of outside interference. Local settlers who had encountered the family generally spoke well of them, praising their generosity and Christian devotion. After all, who else would dedicate their lives to ministering to dying strangers in the middle of nowhere? What made the Graysons particularly effective was their understanding of the trail's brutal realities. They knew that by the time families reached their location, many would be dealing with serious illness, dwindling supplies, and the psychological exhaustion that came from months of hardship. They positioned themselves as the answer to these problems, not just spiritual guides, but practical helpers who could provide medical care, supplies, and even temporary shelter for families too weak to continue immediately. The denomination question never seemed to matter much to desperate families, whether they were Methodist, Baptist, Presbyterian, or any other Protestant faith. The Grayson adapted their approach accordingly. Morai was well versed in various Protestant traditions and could quote scripture in whatever style best comforted his audience. This flexibility was crucial on the frontier where denominational differences often took a backseat to simple survival. The first recorded disappearance occurred on the 23rd of September, 1852. Though investigators would not piece together the timeline until decades later, the Morrison family, James, his pregnant wife Elizabeth, their 3 young children, and Elizabeth's elderly father had been traveling with a wagon train that had dispersed after reaching the Oregon Territory. Like many families, they decided to push on alone toward their final destination, confident they could cover the remaining miles without the protection of a larger group. When the Morrisons' wagon developed a broken axle just 2 miles from the Sacred Heart Chapel, it seemed like divine intervention. James Morrison would later be quoted in territorial records as saying the chapel appeared like a gift from the Almighty when he spotted it from the ridge where his wagon had broken down. Brother Ezekiel, who seemed to have an uncanny ability to appear just when travelers needed help most, arrived at the broken wagon within hours of the accident. "Brother," Ezekiel said in the slow, measured cadence that would become his trademark, "the Lord has placed you near our humble chapel for a reason. Sister Constance has birthed many babies, and your Elizabeth looks ready to deliver any day now. Father Morai would consider it an honor to provide sanctuary while you repair your wagon and prepare for the blessed arrival." The Morrison family gratefully accepted the invitation, moving into the small cabin adjacent to the chapel that the Grayson maintained for exactly such purposes. For 3 days, everything seemed perfectly normal. Sister Constance tended to Elizabeth with gentle care. Brother Ezekiel helped James work on the wagon repairs, and Father Morai provided spiritual comfort to the anxious family. The children played in the chapel yard, while Elizabeth's father, Samuel, rested his arthritic bones in the cabin's comfortable rocking chair. On the 4th day, things began to change. Elizabeth's father was the first to fall ill, complaining of severe stomach cramps and nausea. Sister Constance attributed it to trail sickness, a catch-all term for the various ailments that plagued travelers, and began administering what she called blessed remedies that she prepared from herbs and other ingredients kept in the chapel's basement. "The Lord provides healing through nature's bounty," she would say while mixing her concoctions. "But sometimes the body must purge itself of toxins before the healing can begin." Within hours of taking Sister Constance's medicine, Samuel's condition worsened dramatically. His skin took on a grayish pallor, his breathing became labored, and he began experiencing violent episodes of vomiting and diarrhea. James Morrison, growing alarmed, asked if they should seek help from the trading post to the east, but Father Morai counseled patience. "Brother James," the preacher said, placing a reassuring hand on the younger man's shoulder, "I have seen this sickness many times on the trail. It must run its course. Moving Samuel now would surely kill him. We must trust in the Lord's timing and Sister Constance's healing gifts." By the 6th day, young Tommy Morrison, age 7, began showing similar symptoms than his sister Mary, age 5. Sister Constance worked tirelessly, preparing more remedies, administering what she called purifying treatments, and keeping vigil over the increasingly sick family members. To James and Elizabeth, still healthy but exhausted from caring for their loved ones, the woman seemed like a saint, sent by God to help them through their trial. The truth was far more sinister. The blessed remedies that Sister Constance administered with such apparent devotion contained carefully measured doses of arsenic, which the Grayson had discovered could be obtained from local mining operations under the pretense of pest control. The symptoms, the stomach cramps, nausea, skin discoloration, and eventual organ failure, perfectly mimic those of various trail diseases, making the murders virtually undetectable to grieving family members who had already witnessed so much death and suffering during their journey west. Samuel Morrison died on the 7th day, followed by Tommy on the 9th and Mary on the 11th. Each death was accompanied by elaborate Christian rituals performed by Father Morai, who spoke movingly about the deceased, joining their Heavenly Father and finding peace after their earthly suffering. The remaining family members, devastated by grief, but grateful for the Grayson's spiritual support, never questioned the rapid succession of deaths. After all, entire families had been known to succumb to disease on the trail. What they didn't know was that each night after the grieving survivors had exhausted themselves with weeping and prayer, Brother Ezekiel would systematically search through the family's possessions, making detailed inventories of everything of value. The Morrisons had been relatively prosperous back in Missouri, and their wagon contained fine furniture, quality tools, family heirlooms, and a substantial amount of gold coins that James had sewn into hidden pockets of his clothing. On the 12th day, James Morrison himself began experiencing the telltale symptoms. Elizabeth, now in the early stages of labor and terrified that she would lose her husband as well as her children and father, begged Sister Constance to do everything possible to save him. The woman's response would later be remembered as particularly chilling by those who eventually uncovered the truth. "My dear child," Sister Constance said, holding Elizabeth's trembling hands, "some illnesses are God's way of calling his children home. We must not question his wisdom, only trust in his mercy. Your husband will join your precious babies in paradise, and you will raise your new child, knowing that your family awaits you in glory." James Morrison died on the 14th day, just hours before Elizabeth gave birth to a son who would live only long enough to be baptized by Father Morai. When Elizabeth herself succumbed to the same mysterious illness 3 days later, the entire Morrison family had been wiped out in less than 3 weeks. To any outside observer who might have inquired about the family's fate, the Graysons had a perfectly reasonable explanation. The Morrisons had arrived sick and exhausted from the trail, had contracted a virulent form of dysentery that sometimes struck entire families, and had died despite the best efforts of Christian caregivers who had risked their own lives to provide comfort in their final hours. Father Morai had given them proper Christian burial in the chapel cemetery, and their possessions had been consecrated to the Lord's work, a euphemism for theft that sounded appropriately pious. But the Morrison family's disappearance was only the beginning. The Grayson had discovered something that would transform their lives and terrorize the Oregon Trail for the next 36 years. Murder, when executed with sufficient planning and religious justification, could be extraordinarily profitable. The success of their first family annihilation taught the Graysons valuable lessons that would shape their methodology for decades to come. They learned that isolated families were easier targets than those traveling in groups, that the gradual onset of arsenic poisoning perfectly mimicked common trail ailments, and that their religious authority gave them almost unlimited credibility with desperate grieving people who needed someone to blame besides God for their suffering. Most importantly, they discovered that the Oregon Trail provided them with an endless supply of victims who wouldn't be missed for months, if ever. Unlike settled communities where disappearances would be quickly noticed and investigated, the trail was full of transient families whose exact whereabouts were unknown to relatives back east. A family that vanished in Oregon might not be expected to make contact with loved ones for 6 months or more. And even then, the dangers of frontier life provided countless plausible explanations for their silence. The months following the Morrison murders saw the Graysons refining their operation. With methodical precision, they established patterns and procedures that would serve them well over the years. Brother Ezekiel became their scout, riding the trail approaches to identify promising targets, families with obvious wealth, those traveling alone or in small groups, and especially those already dealing with illness or mechanical problems that made them vulnerable to offers of help. Sister Constance developed her poisoning techniques, experimenting with different doses and delivery methods to achieve maximum effectiveness while maintaining plausible deniability. She discovered that arsenic could be easily disguised in herbal teas, medicinal tinctures, and even communion wine, making it simple to administer to entire families under the guise of spiritual or medical care. Father Morai, meanwhile, perfected the psychological manipulation that kept victims compliant even as their loved ones died around them. He became expert at reading people's denominational backgrounds and adjusting his theological approach accordingly. For Methodist families, he emphasized divine healing and the power of prayer. For Presbyterians, he focused on predestination and God's ultimate plan. For Baptists, he stressed personal salvation and the promise of heavenly reunion. The chapel itself underwent subtle modifications to support their murderous enterprise. The basement was expanded and divided into sections, one area for storing victims' possessions, another for preparing arsenic solutions, and a third that served as a temporary morgue where bodies could be kept while the Grayson decided on disposal methods. They also dug a series of unmarked graves in a grove of trees behind the chapel, locations that would eventually hold the remains of hundreds of their victims. The winter of 1852-1853 provided the Grayson with valuable time to plan and prepare for the next year's killing season. They used the months when the trail was largely empty to sort through the Morrison family's possessions, deciding what to keep, what to sell, and what to hide. They also made their first contact with black market dealers in larger Oregon settlements, establishing relationships with men who asked no questions about the origins of the goods they purchased. Brother Ezekiel proved particularly adept at this aspect of their operation. His honest face and straightforward manner made him believable when he claimed to be selling possessions on behalf of families who had decided to return east or had died of natural causes. He learned to space out his sales across multiple communities and to target different types of buyers for different categories of goods. Fine furniture and household items went to wealthy settlers looking to improve their homes. Tools and farming equipment were sold to practical farmers. Jewelry and precious metals found their way to merchants who specialized in such items. By spring 1853, the Grayson had transformed from amateur killers into professional predators with a sophisticated understanding of their craft. They had resolved the practical problems of victim selection, murder methodology, body disposal, and profit realization. More importantly, they had created a public persona that made them virtually above suspicion. The spring of 1853 brought renewed trail traffic and fresh opportunities for the Grayson family enterprise. Their second major success came in May when they encountered the Hoffman family, German immigrants who spoke limited English and were traveling with a wagon full of valuable possessions, including fine craftsmanship tools, quality textiles, and a substantial amount of gold coins that represented their life savings. The Hoffmans were ideal victims in many ways. Their language barrier made them dependent on the Grayson for communication with other travelers. Their foreign customs made them seem exotic and potentially suspicious to other trail users, and their obvious wealth made them attractive targets. Additionally, their limited English meant they were less likely to understand subtle warnings or to effectively communicate concerns to other travelers. The family's patriarch, Heinrich Hoffmann, was a skilled clockmaker who had brought his tools and trade goods to establish a business in Oregon. His wife, Greta, was pregnant with their fourth child, and their three existing children ranged in age from 6 to 12. When mechanical problems with their wagon forced them to seek help near the Sacred Heart Chapel, the Graysons saw another opportunity to perfect their deadly craft. This time they experimented with different approaches. Instead of waiting for the family to develop natural illness, Sister Constance began administering small doses of arsenic almost immediately, disguised as preventive medicine to ward off trail diseases. She convinced the family that the blessed protection she offered would keep them healthy during their recovery period. "My God," Heinrich said in his broken English when Sister Constance first offered her medicine, "you are so kind to strangers. God will bless you for helping us." "God has already blessed us," Sister Constance replied with practiced sincerity, "by giving us the opportunity to serve his children in their time of need." The Hoffman family's murder took nearly a month to complete, but the extended timeline allowed the Graysons to thoroughly inventory their possessions and establish detailed plans for disposing of the valuable clockmaking tools and trade goods. It also gave them time to study the family's routines and relationships, knowledge that would prove valuable in their future operations. By the end of 1853, the Grayson had successfully murdered 3 complete families, totaling 16 people, and they had begun to see their operation as a business that required the same careful planning and attention to detail as any other profitable enterprise. They started keeping records, not just of their victims' possessions, but of their methods, their mistakes, and their successes. These records, discovered decades later in the chapel's hidden basement compartments, would eventually provide investigators with a horrifying window into the systematic nature of the Grayson family's crimes. Written in Father Morai's precise handwriting, the ledgers contained detailed entries for each family they murdered, including names, dates, possessions taken, disposal methods used, and profits realized from selling stolen goods. The entries were written in a cold, business-like style that treated human lives as inventory items. A typical entry might read, Morrison family, 5 souls departed, September-October 1852. Possessions included 2 gold coins, furniture items, quality tools, bodies interred in Grove Section C. Estimated profit, 400 tons. Method, arsenic via medicinal teas. Duration, 17 days. Lessons learned, reduced dose frequency to extend timeline and reduce suspicion. As word of the Graysons' charitable work spread along the trail, they began attracting victims actively seeking their help. Families who had heard about the good Christian folk who provided aid to travelers would sometimes seek out the Sacred Heart Chapel specifically, walking directly into the trap that the Graysons had so carefully constructed. The Graysons' methodical approach to mass murder evolved significantly during their second year of operation. They had learned from their early experiences that success required not just effective killing techniques, but also sophisticated systems for managing every aspect of their deadly enterprise. Father Morai, with his analytical mind and leadership skills, began treating their operation like a business that happened to involve murder rather than a series of random killings. The summer of 1854 marked a turning point in their methodology when they encountered the Weatherby family from Tennessee. Charles Weatherby was a former Confederate officer who had decided to seek his fortune in Oregon rather than rebuild his war-torn plantation. He traveled with his wife Margaret, their twin daughters Sarah and Susan, aged 15, and Margaret's younger brother David, a skilled blacksmith who had brought his complete set of professional tools. What made the Weatherby case significant was not just their wealth, though. Charles had converted most of his remaining assets into gold coins and jewelry that he kept hidden in a specially constructed compartment in his wagon, but their intelligence and natural suspicion. Charles had been a military officer, trained to notice details and assess threats. Margaret was an educated woman who had read extensively about trail dangers and was naturally cautious about trusting strangers. When the Weatherby wagon developed wheel problems near the chapel, Charles initially resisted the Graysons' offers of assistance. He had heard stories about travelers who had accepted help from strangers and never been seen again. And something about the isolated location and the convenient timing of Brother Ezekiel's appearance made him uneasy. "I appreciate your Christian charity," Charles told Father Morai during their first meeting, "but we've got the skills and tools to handle our own repairs. We'll be moving on directly." Father Morai, however, had become expert at reading people and adapting his approach accordingly. Rather than pressing the issue, he withdrew gracefully, mentioning casually that Sister Constance had mentioned seeing signs of sickness in the area, possibly cholera or dysentery, and suggesting that the family might want to consider staying, but until they were certain, none of them had been exposed. "Of course, Brother Charles," Morai said with apparent understanding. "A wise man protects his family, but I would feel remiss in my Christian duty if I didn't mention that Sister Constance has been treating several cases of trail fever in the past weeks. The symptoms can take time to manifest, and traveling while infected can spread the disease and weaken the body's defenses." The mention of disease had exactly the effect Morai intended. Margaret Weatherby, already exhausted from months of trail life and worried about her daughter's health, began to reconsider their quick departure. When young David developed a mild fever the next day, a fever that Sister Constance claimed was an early symptom of the regional sickness, the family's resistance crumbled. "Perhaps," Margaret suggested to her husband, "we should accept their offer of shelter just until we're certain David isn't seriously ill." Charles agreed reluctantly, but his military training made him maintain a level of alertness that posed a challenge for the Grayson. Unlike their previous victims who had been desperate and grateful, Charles watched everything with calculating eyes and asked pointed questions about the family's background and the fate of other travelers who had sought their help. The Graysons adapted by providing him with carefully crafted stories about their successful treatment of previous families. They showed him the chapel cemetery, pointing out graves that they claimed belonged to travelers who had arrived already dying and had received proper Christian burial. They even introduced him to testimonial letters, forged documents, supposedly written by grateful families who had recovered from serious illnesses and continued safely to their destinations. "Brother Charles," Father Morai said one evening as they sat on the chapel porch, "I understand your caution. A man who has served his country learns to trust carefully. But consider this. If we meant you harm, would we not have acted by now? Would we not choose easier targets than a trained soldier with weapons and watchful eyes?" The psychological manipulation was subtle but effective. By acknowledging Charles's suspicions and military background, Morai made him feel respected and intelligent. By pointing out that he would be a difficult target, the preacher made the idea of being targeted seem less likely. Most importantly, by demonstrating apparent openness and honesty, he gradually lowered Charles's defenses. The actual murders of the Weatherby family took nearly 6 weeks to complete, representing the longest timeline the Graysons had yet attempted. Sister Constance began with extremely small doses of arsenic administered through water that she claimed had been blessed for healing and recommended for preventing the spread of disease. The doses were so small that the symptoms developed very gradually, appearing to be natural illness rather than poisoning. David, the youngest and physically weakest member of the family, succumbed first. His death seemed to confirm Sister Constance's warnings about the regional sickness, and the family's gratitude for her care during his final days made them even more trusting of her medical knowledge. Margaret was next, developing symptoms that Sister Constance attributed to the strain of nursing David through his illness. Charles, trained to analyze battlefield situations, began to notice patterns that disturbed him. The fact that he and his daughters remained healthy while the others grew sick, the peculiar nature of the symptoms, and the Graysons' consistent presence during the worst moments of each family member's illness all contributed to a growing sense of unease. His suspicions reached a crisis point when he discovered Brother Ezekiel examining the contents of his wagon late one night. When confronted, Ezekiel claimed he had been checking to ensure that their possessions were secure and that wild animals hadn't gotten into their supplies. The explanation was plausible, but Charles's instincts told him otherwise. "Margaret," he said to his dying wife the next morning, "I think we need to leave this place. Something isn't right here." But Margaret was too weak to travel, and moving her would likely have killed her. Charles found himself trapped between his growing suspicions and his love for his family. He couldn't abandon his dying wife, but he also couldn't shake the feeling that staying would doom them all. The resolution came when Charles made a discovery that confirmed his worst fears. While searching for medical supplies in the chapel basement, he stumbled upon a hidden compartment containing possessions that clearly belonged to other travelers, items that were too personal and too valuable to have been willingly abandoned by their owners. Among the hidden possessions, he found a child's doll that showed signs of recent ownership, a pocket watch engraved with a name he didn't recognize, and most damning of all, a letter addressed to someone in Oregon City that bore a recent date, but had obviously never been sent. The letter, written in a woman's handwriting, described arriving safely at a chapel and thanking God for the kindness of the Christian family who was caring for her sick children. Charles realized that he had discovered evidence of previous murders and that his family was being systematically poisoned by the very people who claimed to be saving them. But his realization came too late. Margaret died that night, and he awoke the next morning feeling the familiar symptoms that had preceded each family member's death. What Charles didn't know was that the Graysons had been watching him carefully, had noticed his growing suspicions, and had decided to accelerate his poisoning before he could act on his concerns. Father Morai had slipped a massive dose of arsenic into Charles's evening meal, ensuring that the former soldier would be too weak to pose a threat. As Charles lay dying, his twin daughters at his bedside, he made a desperate attempt to warn them about the Graysons' true nature. But his words were dismissed as the ramblings of a fevered mind, and the girls continued to trust the people who were slowly murdering them. The Weatherby case taught the Graysons several important lessons. First, that intelligent, suspicious victims required more sophisticated manipulation techniques. Second, that extending the murder timeline, while riskier, actually made their crimes more believable and profitable. Third, that they needed better methods for detecting and managing victims who became suspicious of their activities. Most importantly, the case demonstrated that even trained, intelligent people could be successfully deceived and murdered if the right psychological techniques were applied with sufficient patience and skill. This realization gave the Graysons confidence to target increasingly wealthy and prominent families, knowing that their methods could overcome even the most careful and suspicious travelers. The discovery of evidence from previous murders in the chapel basement also led to improvements in their evidence disposal procedures. They began burning personal items that could identify victims, melting down jewelry and precious metals to eliminate identifying marks, and creating more sophisticated hiding places for possessions that they intended to keep or sell later. By the end of 1854, the Grayson had murdered 23 people in 7 families, and their operation had become a sophisticated criminal enterprise that generated substantial profits while maintaining complete secrecy. They had also begun to see themselves not as criminals, but as instruments of divine will, who were rewarded for their service by being allowed to prosper from their victims' possessions. The year 1855 marked a crucial turning point in the Graysons' murderous career when they encountered their first major challenge, the survival of an intended victim who had witnessed enough to expose their entire operation. The incident began routinely enough with the arrival of the Patterson family from Ohio, but it would end with the Graysons facing the terrifying possibility of discovery and the need to make desperate choices about their future. Thomas Patterson was a successful merchant who had liquidated his Ohio business to pursue opportunities in Oregon's growing economy. He traveled with his wife Emily, their 4 children aged 8 to 16, and Emily's sister Catherine, an unmarried woman in her 32nd, who served as the family's teacher and caregiver. What made the Patterson family particularly attractive to the Graysons was not just their obvious wealth. Thomas had converted his business assets into easily transportable gold and banknotes, but also their apparent respectability and the likelihood that their disappearance would eventually be noticed by business associates in both Ohio and Oregon. The family's wagon train had dispersed near the Blue Mountains, and they were traveling alone when they encountered Brother Ezekiel approximately 5 miles from the Sacred Heart Chapel. Their wagon had not broken down, and none of the family members were obviously ill, but Ezekiel had learned to create opportunities rather than simply wait for them to occur. "Good afternoon, brother," Ezekiel called out as he approached the Patterson wagon. "I couldn't help but notice your fine team of oxen. That's quality livestock right there. You folks wouldn't happen to be interested in trading for some fresh supplies, would you? We keep a good stock at the chapel just ahead." Thomas Patterson was a shrewd businessman who had learned to evaluate offers carefully before making decisions. He was interested in the possibility of obtaining fresh supplies, but something about Ezekiel's manner, perhaps too friendly, too eager, made him cautious. "We appreciate the offer," Thomas replied, "but we're well supplied for the remainder of our journey. We'll be moving on directly." Ezekiel, however, had prepared for this response. Of course, but I wonder if I might mention something that could save your family considerable trouble, Sister Constance. That's our medical woman. She's been treating several cases of mountain fever in recent weeks. Nasty business that takes hold gradually, and by the time folks realize they're sick, they're too weak to travel safely. The mention of disease had its intended effect on Emily Patterson, who immediately began worrying about her children's health. "Mountain fever?" she asked. "We haven't heard anything about disease in the area." "Well, ma'am," Ezekiel said with practiced concern, "it's not something folks like to talk about. Bad for business, if you know what I mean. But Sister Constance, she's got remedies that can prevent it if administered before the symptoms appear. Might be worth your while to stop by the chapel just to have your family examined." Thomas remained skeptical, but Emily's maternal instincts had been activated. The idea that her children might be exposed to a dangerous disease without her knowledge was terrifying, and the possibility of prevention was too valuable to ignore. "Thomas," she said quietly, "perhaps we should at least speak with this medical woman. If there's disease in the area, shouldn't we take precautions?" Reluctantly, Thomas agreed to visit the chapel, telling himself that they would simply get information about the supposed disease and then continue their journey. He had no way of knowing that this decision would lead to the most harrowing experience of his life and the near destruction of his entire family. The Graysons received the Patterson family with their usual combination of Christian warmth and subtle manipulation. Father Morai impressed Thomas with his knowledge of business and his apparent familiarity with commercial conditions in Oregon. Sister Constance charmed Emily with her gentle manner and her obvious affection for children. Brother Ezekiel entertained the Patterson children with stories of frontier life and demonstrations of his various practical skills. Within hours of their arrival, the family had agreed to spend the night at the chapel to allow Sister Constance to examine everyone for signs of mountain fever. The examination revealed predictably that several family members showed early symptoms that required immediate treatment with Sister Constance's preventive remedies. Catherine Patterson, Emily's sister, was the first to receive treatment. As an unmarried woman with no children of her own, she had devoted her life to caring for her sister's family and was particularly concerned about the children's health. She eagerly accepted Sister Constance's medicine and encouraged the others to do the same. But Catherine was also the most observant member of the family, and she possessed a naturally analytical mind that made her notice details that others might miss. On the second night of their stay, she observed Brother Ezekiel making what appeared to be a careful inventory of their wagon's contents. When she mentioned this to Sister Constance, the older woman dismissed it as routine concern for their security. Brother Ezekiel checks all our guests' possessions. Sister Constance explained, "We've had problems with theft in the past, and we want to ensure that nothing goes missing while families are under our care." The explanation seemed reasonable, but Catherine continued to notice small details that troubled her. The way Father Morai's eyes lingered on Thomas's gold watch, the fact that Sister Constance always prepared her medicines in private, never allowing anyone to observe the process. The peculiar coincidence that every family member who received treatment seemed to develop symptoms that required additional treatment. Catherine's suspicions reached a critical point on the fourth day when she discovered Sister Constance adding a white powder to the medicine intended for young Timothy Patterson, the family's youngest child. When Catherine asked about the powder, Sister Constance claimed it was blessed salt that enhanced the healing properties of the herbs. But Catherine had grown up in Ohio, where her father had been a pharmacist, and she recognized the crystalline appearance of the powder as inconsistent with ordinary salt. More importantly, she noticed that Sister Constance became nervous and defensive when questioned about her methods, quite different from the serene confidence she usually displayed. That evening, Catherine made a decision that would save her life and the lives of her surviving family members. Instead of taking her prescribed medicine, she pretended to drink it while actually spitting it into a handkerchief. She also managed to convince young Timothy to do the same, telling him it was a game they could play together. The results were dramatic and terrifying. While Thomas, Emily, and the three older children continued to weaken from their treatments, Catherine and Timothy remained healthy. More importantly, Catherine began to notice that the sickest family members were those who had been most compliant with Sister Constance's medical regimen. By the sixth day, 2 of the Patterson children had died, and Thomas was clearly dying. Emily, though weak, was still conscious and alert enough to have a conversation with her sister. It was during this conversation that Catherine made the decision to share her suspicions. "Emily," she whispered, "I think these people are poisoning us. I think they're killing our family." Emily's initial reaction was disbelief and anger. The idea that the kind Christian family who had been caring for them could be murderers seemed impossible. But as Catherine explained her observations and the pattern of symptoms, Emily began to see the horrible truth. "What can we do?" Emily asked. "Thomas is dying, the children are dying, and we're too weak to travel." Catherine had been preparing for this question. "We have to get away from here, even if it kills us. Staying here will definitely kill us. And we have to take Timothy. He's the only other one who hasn't been taking the medicine." The escape plan that Catherine devised was desperate and dangerous, but it represented their only chance for survival. She waited until the early hours of the morning when the Graysons were asleep, then helped Emily and Timothy slip out of the cabin. Thomas was too weak to move, and the older children were unconscious, but Catherine made the agonizing decision to leave them behind rather than risk the lives of those who might still be saved. The 3 survivors made their way to the family wagon where Catherine had hidden some of their gold and essential supplies. But as they were preparing to leave, they heard footsteps approaching from the chapel. Father Morai, apparently alerted by some sound, was coming to investigate. "Quick," Catherine whispered. "Hide in the wagon bed under the canvas. Don't make a sound no matter what happens." Father Morai found Catherine standing beside the wagon, and his reaction confirmed her worst fears. Instead of showing concern for a family member who might be sleepwalking or confused by illness, his expression was cold and calculating. "Sister Catherine," he said quietly, "you should be resting. The mountain fever can cause confusion and poor judgment." "I couldn't sleep," Catherine replied, trying to keep her voice steady. "I was worried about Thomas and the children." Morai studied her for a long moment, and Catherine realized that he was evaluating whether she had discovered their secret. The tension stretched between them like a taut wire, each waiting for the other to reveal their intentions. "Perhaps," Morai said finally, "Sister Constance should prepare a stronger remedy for you, something to help you rest more peacefully." Catherine understood that he was proposing to kill her immediately rather than wait for the gradual poisoning to take effect. "That's very thoughtful," she said, "but I think I'll try to sleep naturally first." "I'm afraid I must insist," Morai replied, and his hand moved to something concealed beneath his coat. What happened next would haunt Catherine Patterson for the rest of her life. As Morai stepped toward her, apparently intending to force her back to the cabin, Emily Patterson emerged from behind the wagon. Despite her weakness from the poison, she had managed to arm herself with Thomas's pistol. "Step away from my sister," Emily said, her voice weak but determined. Morai turned toward this new threat, and in that moment of distraction, Catherine grabbed a heavy iron tool from the wagon and struck him in the head. The blow wasn't fatal, but it stunned him long enough for the two women and the child to begin their desperate escape. The wagon pulled away from the Sacred Heart Chapel just as Brother Ezekiel emerged from the main building, alerted by the commotion. The last thing Catherine saw as they fled was Ezekiel running toward the cabin, where the rest of their family lay dying, probably to finish what the poison had started. The escape journey was a nightmare of fear, exhaustion, and grief. Emily, weakened by weeks of poisoning, could barely remain conscious, leaving Catherine to drive the wagon while caring for Timothy and watching for pursuit. They had no clear idea where they were going, only the desperate knowledge that they had to reach help before the Grayson could catch them or the poison could claim Emily's life. For 3 days, they traveled through unfamiliar territory, following what appeared to be old hunting trails and hoping to encounter other travelers or settlements. Timothy, traumatized by the loss of his family and the terrifying escape, barely spoke. Emily drifted in and out of consciousness, sometimes calling for her dead children and husband. On the 4th day, they encountered a military patrol from Fort Dales, soldiers who were investigating reports of Indian activity in the area. Catherine's story of murder and poisoning at the Sacred Heart Chapel was so extraordinary that the patrol leader initially assumed she was delirious from illness or trauma. But Catherine had brought evidence with her, a vial of Sister Constance's medicine that she had saved, samples of the white powder she had seen being added to the treatments, and several items from their wagon that she had observed Brother Ezekiel examining suspiciously. Most importantly, she had Emily as a witness. And although Emily was barely coherent, her symptoms were consistent with arsenic poisoning. The military investigation that followed would expose the true scope of the Graysons' crimes, but it would also reveal that the 3 family members had escaped just in time. When soldiers arrived at the Sacred Heart Chapel, they found Thomas Patterson and his 3 older children dead, their bodies showing clear signs of arsenic poisoning. The Grayson themselves had vanished, taking with them most of the stolen possessions that had been hidden in the chapel basement. The discovery of the basement storage areas provided investigators with their first glimpse into the systematic nature of the Graysons' murders. Hidden compartments contained possessions from dozens of families carefully sorted and catalogued. Most shocking of all were the detailed records that Father Morai had kept, documenting each family's murder with the cold precision of a business ledger. The records revealed that the Patterson family had been the Graysons' 37th intended victim group, and that over a period of less than 3 years, they had murdered more than 150 people. The entries described not just the murders themselves, but also the profits realized from selling stolen goods and the lessons learned from each successful operation. Catherine Patterson's survival and testimony marked the beginning of the end for the Grayson family enterprise. but it would take years for authorities to fully understand the scope of their crimes and track down the perpetrators. Meanwhile, the knowledge that such evil could hide behind a facade of Christian charity sent shockwaves through trail communities and fundamentally changed how travelers approach strangers offering help. The psychological impact on the 3 survivors was devastating and permanent. Emily Patterson never fully recovered from the arsenic poisoning and died within a year of their escape, her body too damaged by the toxic treatments to sustain life. Timothy grew to adulthood, bearing the scars of his childhood trauma, never able to trust religious authorities and plagued by nightmares about the chapel and the deaths of his family members. Catherine Patterson became obsessed with exposing the UAE Grayson and ensuring that they faced justice for their crimes. She provided testimony to military investigators, territorial authorities, and eventually federal marshals, becoming the primary witness whose survival made prosecution possible. Her detailed recollections of the family's methodology and the contents of their secret records would prove crucial in understanding the full extent of their criminal enterprise. But the Grayson had not been idle during their escape from the Sacred Heart Chapel. With years of experience in covering their tracks and substantial financial resources accumulated from their victims, they had prepared for the possibility of discovery and had developed contingency plans for continuing their operations in new locations. The manhunt for the Grayson family began in earnest in the fall of 1855, but the fugitives had several crucial advantages that allowed them to evade capture for nearly 2 years. They possessed detailed knowledge of remote areas throughout Oregon Territory, substantial financial resources from their years of murder and theft, and most importantly, the ability to create new identities and establish themselves in communities where their past was unknown. Federal Marshal William Riss, assigned to lead the investigation, faced challenges unlike any he had previously encountered. The Graysons were not ordinary criminals who had committed a single crime and fled. They were organized killers who had operated successfully for years by exploiting the trust and vulnerability of their victims. Their religious facade had been so convincing that many people who had encountered them refused to believe they were capable of murder. "These aren't desperate men who killed in a moment of passion," Marshal Hiss wrote in his official report. "These are calculating predators who turned murder into a business enterprise. They understand how to manipulate people's faith and charity for evil purposes, and they have the resources and intelligence to reinvent themselves whenever necessary." The breakthrough in the investigation came in the spring of 1857, when authorities in California reported suspicious activities at a remote mission station near the Oregon-California border. The Mission of Divine Mercy had appeared suddenly in a location that provided access to multiple wagon train routes, and travelers who stopped there for help were reportedly disappearing under mysterious circumstances. The mission was operated by a man calling himself Father Benedict Morrison and his 2 assistants, Sister Mary Morrison and Brother Thomas Morrison. To casual observers, they appeared to be a dedicated religious family providing charitable services to travelers in need. But Marshal Hiss recognized the operational pattern from Catherine Patterson's testimony and the evidence found at the Sacred Heart Chapel. The mission's location was strategically chosen to intercept families traveling between Oregon and California, groups who were often isolated, exhausted, and vulnerable to offers of assistance. The building itself was larger than the original chapel, with expanded basement areas and multiple outbuildings that could serve various purposes in a murder and theft operation. Most significantly, local authorities in Northern California had received reports of missing families that matched the Graysons' preferred victim profile. Wealthy families traveling alone or in small groups would seek help at the mission and then simply vanish, leaving no trace of their planned destinations or current whereabouts. Marshal Riss assembled a team of federal agents and military personnel to investigate the mission, but he was determined not to repeat the mistake that had allowed the Grayson to escape from the Sacred Heart Chapel. This time the approach would be carefully planned and executed to prevent the suspects from fleeing or destroying evidence. The investigation team spent several weeks conducting surveillance of the mission from concealed positions in the surrounding hills. What they observed confirmed their worst suspicions. The Morrison family was indeed the Graysons, and they had not only resumed their murderous activities, but had refined their methods based on their previous experience. During the surveillance period, agents witnessed the arrival of the Henderson family from Missouri, a prosperous farming family with 4 children who were traveling to California to establish a new homestead. The family's wagon was loaded with farming equipment, household goods, and what appeared to be substantial financial resources. The Graysons' approach to the Henderson family followed their established pattern with disturbing precision. Father Morai, now calling himself Father Benedict, greeted the family with apparent warmth and immediately began assessing their wealth and vulnerability. Sister Constance, using the name Sister Mary, quickly identified which family members might be most susceptible to her medical treatment. Brother Ezekiel, now Brother Thomas, began evaluating their possessions and transportation, but the surveillance team also observed new elements in the Graysons' operation that demonstrated how their methods had evolved. They had recruited several accomplices, local men who posed as legitimate traders and scouts, but who actually served as lookouts and assistants in the murder process. They had also developed more sophisticated techniques for disposing of bodies and concealing evidence. Most chilling of all, the agents observed the Grayson testing different approaches to family annihilation. Rather than relying solely on gradual arsenic poisoning, they experimented with faster-acting methods that could eliminate entire families within days rather than weeks. They had apparently concluded that their previous timeline was too risky and that quicker murders would be less likely to attract attention. Marshal Hayes faced a terrible dilemma as he watched the Henderson family being drawn into the Graysons' trap. Intervening immediately might save the Henderson family, but it would also allow the Grayson to escape again, potentially to resume their activities elsewhere. Waiting for more evidence might provide the proof needed for successful prosecution, but it would almost certainly result in the deaths of innocent people. The decision was made for him when one of his agents observed Brother Ezekiel administering what appeared to be a large dose of poison to the youngest Henderson child. The boy, who had been healthy and active that morning, suddenly became violently ill after drinking milk that Ezekiel had personally delivered to him. "We move now," Chris told his team. "We can't let another family die while we gather evidence." The raid on the mission of Divine Mercy began at dawn on the 15th of June, 1857, nearly 2 years after the Graysons' escape from the Sacred Heart Chapel. Federal agents and military personnel surrounded the compound while the family was still asleep, preventing any possibility of escape or evidence destruction. What they found inside the mission buildings exceeded even their worst expectations. The basement areas contained possessions from at least 20 families, far more than could have been accumulated during the Graysons' brief time at this location. Hidden compartments revealed detailed records of murders committed not just in Oregon and California, but also in other territories where the family had apparently operated before establishing their Oregon base. The records painted a picture of criminal enterprise that spanned more than a decade and multiple states. The Graysons had been murdering travelers and stealing their possessions since at least 1845, moving from location to location as circumstances required, and leaving behind a trail of death that investigators were only beginning to understand. Father Morai's journals contained entries that revealed the psychological evolution of the family's criminal activities. Early entries showed some evidence of guilt and religious justification for their actions, with Morai convincing himself that he was providing mercy to suffering travelers while being rewarded by God for his charitable work. But later entries demonstrated a complete abandonment of any moral considerations. The murders were described purely in terms of profit and efficiency, with detailed analysis of which methods produced the best results and which types of victims offered the greatest rewards. The journals read like the business records of a particularly successful enterprise, with human lives reduced to inventory items and murder treated as a routine operational procedure. Most disturbing of all were the entries describing the family's future plans. Morai had been developing schemes for expanding their operation to include multiple locations with different family members, running separate murder sites along various travel routes. He had also been experimenting with ways to kill larger groups of people simultaneously, apparently motivated by the inefficiency of murdering families one by one. The capture of the Henderson family in the early stages of poisoning allowed investigators to save their lives and obtain first-hand testimony about the Graysons' methods. James Henderson, the family patriarch, provided detailed accounts of how the family had been manipulated and how the poisoning process had been disguised as medical treatment. They seemed like angels sent by God. Henderson told investigators, "Sister Mary was so gentle with our children, so knowledgeable about treating sickness." Father Benedict spoke with such authority about Scripture and God's will. "If someone had told me they were murderers, I would have called them crazy." The psychological manipulation techniques that the Graysons employed were sophisticated enough to deceive intelligent, educated people who had been specifically warned about the dangers of trusting strangers on the trail. Their religious authority, combined with their apparent medical knowledge and genuine charitable actions, created a facade that was nearly impossible to penetrate until it was too late. Sister Constance, when finally questioned by authorities, showed no remorse for her role in the murders. Instead, she expressed anger at being prevented from completing her medical treatments and insisted that the families they had killed were better off dead than continuing to suffer from trail diseases. "Those people were dying anyway," she told Marshal Hendricks during her interrogation. "We gave them comfort in their final days and ensured that their possessions went to support God's work rather than being wasted. We provided mercy that they wouldn't have received otherwise." Brother Ezekiel maintained his silence throughout the interrogation process, refusing to provide any information about their activities or express any opinion about their crimes. His behavior suggested that he viewed himself as a faithful follower who had simply obeyed orders without questioning their moral implications. Father Morai, however, displayed a completely different personality when confronted with evidence of his crimes. The charming, authoritative preacher disappeared, replaced by a cold, calculating killer who showed no emotion when presented with testimony from survivors or evidence of his victims' suffering. "You people don't understand what we accomplished," he told investigators. "We eliminated the weak and the diseased. We redistributed wealth from those who couldn't protect it to those who could use it effectively. And we provided spiritual comfort to people who would have died horrible deaths anyway. We were instruments of natural selection and divine will." The scope of the Graysons' crimes continued to expand as investigators analyzed their records and connected them to unsolved disappearances throughout the Western Territories. Families that had vanished without explanation, isolated graves discovered by later travelers, and reports of mysterious illnesses at remote religious sites all began to form a pattern that pointed to the Graysons' involvement. By the time the investigation was complete, authorities had connected the family to the murders of more than 800 people across multiple states and territories. The actual number was likely higher, as many of their victims had been transient families whose disappearances had never been officially reported or investigated. The trial of the Grayson family began in September 1857 and quickly became one of the most sensational criminal proceedings in American frontier history. The prosecution, led by Territorial Attorney General Samuel Morrison, faced the challenge of presenting evidence of crimes that had been carefully concealed and victims who were no longer alive to testify. The key to the prosecution's case was the meticulous records that Father Morai had kept throughout their criminal career. These journals provided detailed accounts of individual murders, methods used, possessions stolen, and profits realized, written in Morai's own handwriting, and containing information that only the perpetrators could have known. The records served as confessions that could not be disputed or explained away. Catherine Patterson's testimony provided crucial context for understanding how the murders were carried out and how the family had been able to deceive their victims so effectively. Her survival story demonstrated both the systematic nature of the Graysons' methods and the psychological manipulation techniques they employed to maintain control over their victims. The Henderson family's testimony showed that the Graysons had continued and refined their murderous activities even after their escape from the Sacred Heart Chapel. Their account of the attempted murders at the Mission of Divine Mercy proved that the family had learned from their previous mistakes and had developed even more efficient methods for killing entire families quickly. Perhaps most damaging to the defense was the physical evidence found at both the Sacred Heart Chapel and the Mission of Divine Mercy. Investigators had discovered not just possessions from murdered families, but also the tools and supplies used in the poisoning process. Detailed maps showing the locations of unmarked graves, and correspondence with black market dealers who had purchased stolen goods. The defense attorneys attempted to argue that the family had been providing legitimate medical care to sick travelers and that the deaths had been caused by diseases contracted during trail travel rather than deliberate poisoning. They suggested that the possession of other families' belongings could be explained by legitimate purchases or inheritance from grateful patients who had died despite their care. But the prosecution was able to demonstrate that the patterns of death at locations operated by the Grayson were statistically impossible unless deliberate murder was involved. Expert medical testimony confirmed that the symptoms described by survivors were consistent with arsenic poisoning rather than natural trail diseases. Most importantly, the family's own records clearly described their activities as murder committed for profit rather than medical treatment provided for charitable purposes. The trial lasted 6 weeks and attracted national attention as newspapers across the country reported on the systematic murder of trail families by people posing as Christian missionaries. The case highlighted the vulnerability of westward migrants and the ease with which predators could exploit the trust and desperation of families seeking help in isolated areas. Father Morai Grayson was convicted on charges of multiple murder and sentenced to death by hanging. Sister Constance Grayson was also convicted of murder and sentenced to life imprisonment, making her one of the first women in American frontier history to receive such a severe sentence for criminal activity. Brother Ezekiel Grayson was convicted as an accessory to murder and sentenced to 20 years in territorial prison. The executions and imprisonment of the Grayson family marked the end of one of the most horrific criminal enterprises in American frontier history. But the impact of their crimes extended far beyond the immediate victims and their families. The case fundamentally changed how travelers approached offers of help from strangers and led to increased military patrols along major travel routes. Religious communities throughout the frontier territories were forced to confront the reality that their faith and charitable instincts could be exploited by predators who understood how to manipulate Christian charity for evil purposes. Many legitimate missionaries and religious workers found that their efforts to help travelers were met with suspicion and fear as people struggled to distinguish between genuine charitable work and potential criminal activity. The Graysons' crimes also exposed significant weaknesses in frontier law enforcement and communication systems. The family had been able to operate for more than a decade without detection, partly because there was no effective way for authorities in different territories to share information about suspicious activities or missing persons. The case led to improvements in interterritorial communication and the establishment of more systematic approaches to investigating missing persons reports. Catherine Patterson, the survivor whose testimony had been crucial to the prosecution, never fully recovered from her traumatic experience with the Grayson family. She spent the remainder of her life advocating for improved protection of travelers and working with law enforcement agencies to identify and investigate suspicious activities at remote religious sites. Her nephew Timothy, the young boy who had survived the family's attempted murder, grew to adulthood bearing psychological scars that affected his entire life. He never married, never had children of his own, and spent his adult years working as a frontier guide, helping other families avoid the dangers that had destroyed his own family. The physical locations where the Grayson had operated were abandoned and eventually destroyed by local communities that wanted to eliminate all traces of the horrible crimes that had been committed there. The Sacred Heart Chapel was burned to the ground in 1858, and the Mission of Divine Mercy was dismantled and its materials used for other construction projects. But the psychological impact of the Graysons' crimes lingered for generations. Families throughout the Western territories told stories about the false missionaries who had murdered hundreds of innocent people, using these tales as warnings about the dangers of trusting strangers who offered help on isolated trails. The case also raised disturbing questions about the nature of evil and the capacity for ordinary people to commit extraordinary crimes. Father Morai, Sister Constance, and Brother Ezekiel had not been obviously deranged or visibly dangerous individuals. They had been intelligent, articulate people who had successfully posed as charitable Christians for more than a decade. Their ability to maintain their facade while systematically murdering innocent families challenged fundamental assumptions about human nature and the reliability of religious authority. The case demonstrated that evil could be methodical, organized, and sustained over long periods by people who appeared to be pillars of their communities. Perhaps most disturbing of all was the realization that the Grayson had genuinely believed that their actions were justified and had convinced themselves that they were performing a service by eliminating weak and diseased travelers while redistributing their possessions to more deserving recipients. Their self-righteousness and lack of remorse suggested a form of moral corruption that was far more dangerous than simple greed or desperation. The legacy of the Grayson family murders serves as a reminder that the American frontier was shaped not just by the courage and determination of honest pioneers, but also by the predators who sought to exploit their vulnerability and trust. The 800 people who died at the hands of the false missionaries represent a dark chapter in the story of westward expansion. A chapter that reveals the full range of human capacity for both good and evil. Their story stands as a testament to the importance of vigilance, the dangers of blind trust, and the terrible price that innocent people can pay when evil disguises itself as righteousness. In the end, the Graysons' crimes remind us that the most dangerous predators are often those who understand exactly how to exploit our noblest instincts for their own malevolent purposes. Today, more than a century and a half after the Graysons met their justice, their story continues to haunt the collective memory of the American West. The families they destroyed, the trust they betrayed, and the lives they cut short serve as permanent reminders that evil can flourish anywhere. Human vulnerability and desperation create opportunities for exploitation. The courage of survivors like Catherine Patterson, who risked everything to expose the truth and seek justice for the dead, provides a counterpoint to the darkness of the Graysons' legacy. Her testimony not only brought the killers to justice, but also saved countless future lives by alerting authorities and the public to the dangers posed by predators who used religious authority to mask their criminal activities. In remembering the Grayson family's crimes, we honor not just the victims who died, but also the survivors who found the strength to fight back against evil and ensure that justice was finally served. Their story reminds us that even in humanity's darkest moments, there are always those who will stand up for truth and refuse to let evil triumph unchallenged. What do you think about this chilling tale from America's frontier past? Does it change how you view the romanticized stories of westward expansion? The Grayson family's systematic exploitation of Christian charity reveals the darkest aspects of human nature and the terrible price of misplaced trust. If this story has given you chills and made you think about the hidden dangers that lurked on the frontier trails, share it with someone who loves dark historical mysteries. Hit that like button to support content that brings these forgotten horrors to light, and subscribe so you never miss the disturbing truths that shaped America's past. The next time you hear stories about the brave pioneers who conquered the American West, remember that they also had to survive predators like the Graysons, people who turned murder into a family business and hid their evil behind the mask of religious devotion.